Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back in another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, affordability is both a campaign talking point and a Democrat hoax. And that's a post from Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the TikTok cringe subreddit entitled, I can't believe I'm still surrounded by family and friends who still support him. And that looks like the clip of Donald Trump saying one thing in 2025 about affordability. No, he says one thing in 2024 about affordability. He says, starting day one, we will let inflation make America affordable again, with the word affordability is, and then 2025 says, but the word affordability is a Democrat scam. I guess, Donald Trump does contradict himself a lot compared to what he said on the campaign trail, but, show me a politician who doesn't. That's very much politics for you. They'll say one thing on the campaign trail, and then they'll take office and say the opposite, and that's very. But Reddit only seems to care about that in regards to Donald Trump, not any other politician. Maybe if they have an R next to their name, but definitely not if they have a D next to their name. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ICE can now spy on every phone in your neighborhood from Wired.com, posted by FastSeaArena739, and that's cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And yeah, personally, every government agency can spy on whatever they feel like, and ultimately, there's nothing you can do about it. As I stated many times, the NSA spying revelations were in 2013 that they were spying on U.S. citizens, and it's probably only gotten worse since then. If you think there's probably at least 10 government agencies spying on you, and that doesn't even count foreign governments and private corporations as well, I would say. And so definitely, it's not good from a libertarian perspective. But it's more par for the course than anything else at this point, I think. Next, we have Trump is weighing options against Iran, reports from CNBC.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I do think all the Iran stuff going on, apparently there's some massive protests going on over there. I definitely do think, they might be U.S. government astroturfed by the U.S. government, because, the U.S. government always wants regime change to make other countries more friendly to it, just like they had with Venezuela about a week or two ago. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for it. I definitely don't really care for the current Iranian government. I think they're authoritarian as hell. But regardless, I definitely do think the U.S. is the one who's really astroturfing the regime change over there, just like they kind of did in Ukraine back in 2014 with Euromaidan, and how they astroturfed a protest movement that resulted in a coup that resulted in the overthrow of the previous pro-Russian government with a new pro-Western government. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have statement from Federal Reserve Chair Jerome H. Powell, in parentheses, DOJ threatening criminal charges to undermine Federal Reserve independence for the president, from FederalReserve.com, FederalReserve.gov, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the Federal Reserve, but I definitely do think, Donald Trump, he shouldn't have the sole say over monetary policy either. I think the libertarian position is you got to get the government out of money, so you got to get the government out of everything else. And yeah, personally, I think everyone maybe should have use whatever currency they feel like. I think having a centralized government-backed currency sounds good in theory, but in practice, it just leads to the government having too much control over money, and ultimately, with the government having too much control over anything isn't good. Next, we have more footage from the door-to-door raids taking place across the Twin Cities area today. Here's a family's house can be seen being raided by masked, heavily armed ICE agents without a valid warrant while children are present. Posted by FlimsyHout5563, and that's a cross post from the underreported news subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the government can do whatever they want. They can go door to door however they feel like, and I personally don't really care for it, but ultimately, it's interesting. It's just how it works with the legal monopoly and the use of force. They can just whatever they feel like. Also, I think it's funny how they hate that they're masked, but back during COVID, all the redditors say, oh, you gotta wear a mask, but now the ICE agents are wearing a mask, and suddenly they're the worst thing ever. And to go show you, Reddit isn't consistent when it comes to its beliefs. It just depends who's in the in group, who's in the out group for them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. border agents intentionally stepped in front of moving vehicles by shooting at them, from thenation.com, posted by Fear the Creeper. And they added, it should be recognized that a half-ounce, 200-grain bullet is unlikely to stop a 4,000-pound moving vehicle. And if the driver is disabled by a bullet, the vehicle will become a totally unguided threat. Obviously, shooting a moving vehicle can pose a risk to bystanders, including other agents. And I guess I would agree with that, but ultimately the government that government agents can justify shooting whoever they feel like for whatever reason they feel like. I personally don't really care if there's if you're in a moving vehicle or not. Ultimately, the government has the legal monopoly to use the force to kill you whenever a second it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And even after it happens, the news cycle will just move on to the next one most of the time, and that's very much how people work. People are mad about Renee Good now, but eventually people will just move on to whatever the next thing is, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ICE training minimized to placate Trump, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Blue Sky Skeets subreddit entitled "Don't Let Him Off the Hook," which looks like it's since been deleted. And yeah, personally, I don't really know what that was about, but I really don't care for ICE. They're just another free letter agency. If you ask me, if it were up to me, my version of ICE would be a private militia rather than a public government agency, and they would only go after violent criminals rather than anyone who's here illegally. I do think any illegal immigrant, they could be living off the welfare state, but ultimately, I think that the libertarian argument is you've got to get rid of the welfare state entirely. Then illegal immigration will be less of a problem, and you can focus on only the violent criminals. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. hits $38 trillion in debt after the fastest accumulation of $1 trillion outside of the pandemic. In parentheses, cons again exploded the debt faster than the biggest socialist boogeyman ever could, from PBS.org, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally don't really care for it, but Reddit didn't care about the national debt when Biden was in office, but now that the orange man's back in power, suddenly it's the most important thing to them. It's a lot of issues when it comes to Reddit, like inflation or the border. Reddit only cares about a lot of issues when the out group's in power, but when the in group's in power, they'll justify any excuse in the book to defend the in group. While throwing the book fully at the out group for the same stuff, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, this is so clearly a cover-up. Rep. Stansbury blasts Trump admin for slow-walking Epstein files from MS Now, formerly MSNBC, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I think a lot of people have moved on from the Epstein files at this point. If they've moved on to like the ICE in Venezuela and Greenland and Iran and all that. And it just goes to show you, eventually people are just going to move on to whatever the current thing is. And, I do think the Epstein files, I think, at this point, they can only really be underwhelming. They could be released in full and no one will face any consequences for them, I would think. Because, ultimately, it's the elites who are in them, and the elites are never going to hold themselves accountable for their own crimes. And, yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but, ultimately, I definitely do think, people are moving on, or have already moved on to the next thing. And, Reddit's going to try and keep saying Epstein files as much as possible since the orange man's in them. But, ultimately, they don't really care about them much besides that. And, eventually, they'll realize that, nothing's going to happen because of them. And, that's very much a lot of things that are incriminating to people in power, they're not going to ever come out or be released in full. And if they're released in full, ultimately, they're not going to really lead to any consequences a lot of the time. And, ultimately, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Because the elites it's a two-tier justice system, and the elites who are in the Epstein files are in the top tier, while the peasants like us are in the bottom tier. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have free speech equals death penalty from open.substack.com, posted by Helpful Eating, and that's cross-post from the Minnesota subreddit. Trump, Renee Nicole Good was killed for being highly disrespectful, and that's the link to a Substack post entitled, I think probably the same thing, yeah. Trump, Renee Nicole Good was killed for being highly disrespectful. And yeah, personally, I don't think you should be disrespecting any law enforcement officers because, ultimately they have the legal monopoly force to kill you whenever they feel like. But, ultimately, I do think, if you want to disrespect them, I think you should be able to, but and not fear all of your not fear being killed over it. But ultimately, if you just by doing whatever you feel like, maybe it will result in your death. But sometimes that's how life is. Everyone's gonna die at some point. Maybe your death will come at some time too. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ICE kidnapped 17-year-old U.S. citizen working at Target, then dump him bleeding and crying miles away in a Walmart parking lot, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Minnesota subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for it, but ultimately the government has legal monopoly on the use of force to justify whatever it feels like. But regardless, of course, Reddit's going to always find a way to spin things to their narrative. There might be more context needed here. Maybe he was causing trouble or something. But, ultimately, Reddit's always going to see the world how it wants to see the world, just like how a lot of people are going to see the world how they want to see the world. Like, if you look at how people look at the video of the ICE killing of Renee Nicole Good, a lot of people on the left will say, oh, the ICE agent wasn't justified. Well, a lot of people on the right will say, oh, they were. And ultimately, people will come to whatever conclusions they want to that best fits their ideology a lot of the time. Next, we have Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem just announced a nationwide DHS, ICE, CBP drone surveillance program. ICE drones are coming to U.S. near you, 1/12/26. And that's posted by Mundane Image 13. That's cross-post from the Ice Watch subreddit, and that's a Twitter post from Kristi Noem, who tweeted, "Drones represent the new frontier of American air superiority. Under President Trump, we are entering a new era to defend our air superiority, to protect our borders and the interior of the United States. With the creation of the DHS Program Executive Office for Unmanned Aircraft Systems and Counter-Unmanned Aircraft Systems, President Trump continues his historic legacy in developing American dominance. His objectives continue to secure the border and cripple the cartels, protect our infrastructure, and keep Americans safe as they attend festivities and events during the historic year of America's 250th birthday in FIFA 2026. And yeah, personally, I don't think there should be government drones everywhere, but ultimately, the government can just by doing whatever they feel like a lot of the time, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. If they want to fly drones everywhere, ultimately they can justify doing whatever they feel like, and yeah, sometimes you can't do anything about it since they have the legal monopoly in use of force. Next, we have Trump 2.0 Year 1, a Libertarian Nightmare from Reason.com, posted by I Tried I Can't. And yeah, personally, I personally would agree that's kind of been a bad year for libertarians. But I would say it's more par for the course than some unique evil. I would say pretty much every year since World War II has been some version of a libertarian nightmare. It's kind of par for the course at this point. But of course, Reddit only cares that so bad because Trump's in power. If Biden or another Dem was still in power, Reddit would be downplaying everything. Just like because Reddit only cares who's in the in group, who's in the out group. If Trump was in the in group, Reddit would think it's the greatest year ever. But Reddit only seems to care about its narratives rather than having any consistency, as I've stated pretty much innumerable times on this podcast. Next, we have Iranian woman burning pictures of Iran Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei to light their cigarettes, posted by DMBFFF, and that's a cross-post from the 4B Movement subreddit. And yeah, personally, if they want to do that, I think they should be able to. But I think it's interesting. The first image was actually a woman in Canada back in, I think, a few years ago. And I think it's interesting how they're trying to make it, the media is really pushing it as a trend because the media, much like the government, wants regime change in Iran. And they're astroturfing it with this whole, oh, look, the ladies are using cigarettes to burn the pictures of the Supreme Leader. I personally don't really care for the Supreme Leader. You burn his picture however you feel like, but it's not something that's organic. It's something that's being astroturfed by the government in order to justify regime change in Iran. And of course, progressive Reddit is all over it because they don't like Iran because it's very repressive to women, and they're all about women's rights and all that. And ultimately, people are going to follow whatever agenda they feel like. But you definitely do have to realize that like a lot of things these days, this isn't something that's organic. It's something that's astroturfed by the U.S. government and media to justify regime change in Iran, and that's not something that I personally think the U.S. should be doing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna. And then we have another post. Republican Congressman proposes bill to make Greenland 51st state. CBSNews.com, hosted by Monday Image 13. And yeah, personally, and they added, what the actual fuck is going through Maggie's mind? This universally bad idea will lead to the upper collapse of America's superpower, and that's not really hyperbole. And asterisk, hacking Greenland Denmark will be the end of NATO and the end of the U.S. having any allies. The U.S. cannot maintain superpower status without allies. And yeah, personally, I think Greenland's just kind of a Republican circle jerk thing currently. I don't think anything's going to come of it. But that being said, you never really know these days, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see at this point. And yeah, I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.